All right, welcome back to another edition of the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're joined again by Evert, this time to talk about German spy rings operating in South Africa in the early years of the Second World War. I've been personally looking forward to this one since it's a niche interest of mine, so this is going to be really, really interesting. Evert, welcome back to the show. To get us started, could you set the stage by explaining the political situation in South Africa at the time?
Thanks, Max and Tony, for having me on again. So South Africa, on the eve of the Second World War, was quite an interesting place. It was a divided nation, largely. There was a strong Afrikaner segment that was opposed to South African joining the war effort on behalf of the Allies. There was a strong cultural organization. Well, that's been labeled as a cultural organization. One could probably say it was a bit more activistic or militant. That was called the Ossewaal Brandwag, which was loosely translated to the Oxwagon Sentinel. That galvanized Afrikaner support in about 1938, around the centenary of the Great Trek, when many Afrikaans families left the Cape Colony in 1836 and moved into the interior of South Africa. So on the one hand, you had this grouping that was very pro-German and very anti-British. And then, of course, you had the South Africans, mainly, not just of British descent, but also some Afrikaners that were more favorable to supporting the war effort. They were smutsmen, and this was all playing out against the background of South Africa joining the war. So the government of the day, they lost the vote on whether to or not to take part in the war, and Smuts then formed a new cabinet. This sort of polarized the decision to join the war effort, polarized South Africa quite a bit. And these segments, the Ossewaal Brandwag and those other militant/cultural segments would, of course, as we'll discuss it in the next few minutes, start looking for ways to contact the Germans and to try and actively work against the Allied war effort, and to, of course, then support the German war effort.
Thanks for that, David. And in today's episode, we're focusing on two important characters that you mentioned in those spy rings trying to contact German colleagues across the continent and then in Europe. So Hans Rooseboom and Will and Mareki Radley. And can you give us a bit of background on both of them?
So the two major role players in this early part of the war that sort of, I would say, argue would be the foundation of sort of the German contacts, and then later on the first German intelligence organization. Yeah, it was the Radleys, Will and Mareki Radley. And then there was Hans Rooseboom. So the Radleys were in Germany sort of when the war broke out. Will had been busy completing his PhD in Germany. And to supplement his allowances or to make some extra money, they became involved with a radio station called Radio Zeesen that was broadcasting on a shortwave transmitter all over the world. They had an Afrikaans service. So Will and his wife became involved in transmitting, one could probably arguably say it was propaganda of sorts, news items, cultural items. And yeah, when the war came out, they found themselves stranded. They had to try and, make a decision, stay in Germany or try to get back to South Africa. But if you're busy completing a PhD, you of course want to first get that done sort of out of the way as well. So when the war broke out, they were contacted by the Abwehr, and they were requested to smuggle secret messages back to South Africa and to contact the opposition. And we'll talk about that a bit more in the next few minutes. But very interestingly, the Germans were actually quite intent on contacting the National Party of D.F. Malan, who became Prime Minister in 1948. So it wasn't yet the Ossewaal Brandwag. And we'll talk about them now a bit more. But the second character, Hans Rooseboom, was a German who became a naturalized South African. He was a reporter, and he also was in Germany at the outbreak of the war when they invaded Poland. And he too was recruited by the Abwehr to come back to South Africa and to start a rudimentary intelligence espionage organization. So two very different, not actually that different, but they, as we'll talk now, they'll sort of have different outcomes. But yes, the Radleys and the Rooseboom and Rooseboom were definitely the key role players during this period.
I have some questions about the Radley couple once they get back to South Africa. But first, when the Abwehr recruited them, was it purely ideological or did financial pressure also play a role here? Because from what you said, it sounds like they might have been motivated by both.
I think it's a good question. I think it was a bit of both. Well, they knew they were already involved with the radio station, and they knew that they were actually quite in a precarious position once war had broken out because they wanted to get back to South Africa. So the one way that they could get it done, if you don't have any money, you need a sponsor of sorts. And the Germans did facilitate their journeys to South Africa, but on the precondition that they would have to act as something maybe akin to couriers rather than agents. So I think, the Germans, they were clever. The German intelligence network, the Abwehr, they knew what they had, and they leveraged their position to get something out of it. So the Radleys were probably, if there was anybody else, they might have done the same to them. They were just the vehicles that they would use to try and contact the opposition.
So as per usual, we have both financial and political motivation at play here.
Yeah.
Once the Radleys arrive in South Africa, how do they go about establishing contact with Oswald Brandtwacht?
Yeah, so very interesting. Firstly, his wife, Mariki, she gets sent the first time around. She is made to memorize a message, goes into detail in the book, but it basically bears down to the fact that the German government wishes to make contact with the opposition in South Africa, and they're looking for ways in which they can cooperate. So she memorizes this message. She gets given money. She travels via Italy. She boards a vessel there and sails down through sort of the Suez Canal. Well, she's on an Italian liner because, of course, Italy is not in the war yet. She gets off in Durban and she makes it all the way. Her in-laws picks her up. They go to the farm in the Free State. She's not picked up by the South African police at all. And when she is finally on the farm, she confides into the local reverend that she needs to now contact the opposition. And he interestingly says to her, well, you should go to Bloemfontein. There is the administrator of the Free State is a guy named Hans van Rensburg. He is also the leader of the Oswald Brandtwacht, and he'll be the one that can put you into touch with DF Malan. So she delivers this message, and the crow cries the first time, or the chicken, or the rooster. And Van Rensburg doesn't pass along this message. He keeps it. And we'll get to why that's important in a while. Then she reports back, whichever by secret way, messages that she has delivered this message, but nothing happens. Then Will, later on in the next few months, he comes back to South Africa. He carries the same message again. He also makes it all the way to Durban. He manages to slip through the South African police again, gets to the farm, and then later on, he's visited by a couple of detectives. And he then also goes to Van Rensburg, delivers the same message, and Van Rensburg again promises to hand it over to DF Malan, which again he doesn't do. So my argument here would be that it's quite interesting already that in this early part of the war, the Oswald Brandtwacht tried to keep their hands on the contact with the Germans and didn't pass it along to the National Party, whom the Germans wanted to communicate with in the first place. And later on, and what we'll talk about in the next podcast, is how the Oswald Brandtwacht then actually become the principal cog from a South African side in this German intelligence network that would then grow throughout 1940, 1942 and onwards. So the Radleys were very important. They were this first attempt by the Germans to contact the South African opposition. Ultimately not that successful, but they nevertheless did it.
That's interesting. Yeah, good power play there by the Oswald Brandtwacht. And could you maybe just give us a little bit on Hans Rooseboom? Because at some point he ends up in detention. So obviously something's working over here, despite, I know you mentioned everyone slipping through the net.
So Rooseboom, he's interesting. He obviously follows a bit after the Radleys, but he also makes it to South Africa. When he returns to South Africa, he's a Hansard reporter in the Union Parliament. So he actually has access to quite a few influential people, but he also has a big mouth. And he immediately starts telling certain influential people that he's been sent to South Africa to spy for the Germans, and he's supposed to do this and that and whatever. And I mean, if you're telling it to the wrong people, word gets round. So he gets visited by the police and eventually gets interned in an internment camp. And what happens at this stage is that there's a big fight, sort of riot that breaks out in one of the camps, the internment camps, where the Union Defense Force, the prison guards, and the troops and the German internees sort of have it out with one another, and there's a big boxing match. And news of this filters back to the camp where Rooseboom is, and he says to the Ossewaal Brandwacht that he can get this message out into the world. He can establish, he's got contact with the Germans. All they need to do is to facilitate him passing the message on to Lorenzo Marx, which is modern day Maputo in Mozambique. And this message will, if he can get this out, they will broadcast this over the radio. And of course, this is what the Ossewaal Brandwacht was looking for. They were looking for this direct contact sort of with the German government. So they say, no, it's fine, we'll help you. And they smuggle out this message, it passes, all the way through. And lo and behold, a day or what later, this verbatim report is broadcasted over Radio Zeersen, where the Radleys had worked, and his credentials is immediately established with both, of course, the Ossewaal Brandwacht and the German government, or the Abwehr at least now, has seen that their boy is active. So that is sort of the start of this Rooseboom secret organization, and it will now just change a bit.
I want to cut in for a moment there because it's so interesting. Because earlier you mentioned, and Max also, you had the Radleys, they had a bit of money, and then you think about this acronym MICE, with the spy games always, right? So money, ideology, coercion, ego. Luckily, I remember that, because that would have been embarrassing.
Yeah.
Whenever you call it out. So on the one, you have a bit of that money, a bit of ideology, and then here you have the ego part a little bit from what you've said, big mouth.
Absolutely.
But I'm keen to know, because it's a bit of daring do, how does he get out of the Leeuwkop internment camp?
So yeah, this is now the second part of the story. So of course, the Germans now wanted to establish direct communication with the Germans. And Rooseboom in his person could facilitate this. So he says to them, well, I've got to establish this intelligence organization. This is what I was sent here to. And I can also help you to establish direct contact with Germany. So part of the deal is then that they would help him to escape. I mean, the book tells it about him hiding away and dug into the ground, and it's a whole story. And he escapes, and then he has to now live up to his part of the deal, and he has to help the Ossewaal Brandwacht establish contact with Abwehr, with Germany, and he does so. So the first thing that he transmits is a couple of questions. I think it's about 6 or 7 questions, if I remember correctly, via his network, via Lorenzo Marx, via Maputo, back to Germany, and it's reported back to them. Whatever, they get a reply back from the German government, answers on all of their questions, what they would do in the event of a German victory, blah, blah, blah. And then Rooseboom actually now starts setting up this rudimentary, well, I call it rudimentary, but he starts setting up his intelligence organization. And they principally operate out of Johannesburg. Not very sophisticated. They have a radio that they transmit with. They used a basic code, commercial code that they would use to communicate with Maputo, with Lorenzo Marx, and of course there the bigger organization, the German intelligence network, was the Tromke network, which was run by the German consulate and particularly a guy named Leuthold Everts. So of course, Rooseboom had the facilities. He could communicate with Germany via Maputo, but he needed somebody to help him collect intelligence. So of course, political intelligence is of course was a lot easier to collect. You could read the newspapers, you could listen to the scuttlebutt on the street. He had access to many different avenues where he could get that. But of course, what I think Germany really wanted, especially during this early part of the war, and we talked about the submarine operations in the previous podcast, is that they wanted to know about naval intelligence, military intelligence. So in order to get that type of intelligence, Rooseboom had to rely on the network of the Ossewaal Brandwacht sympathizers, which was all throughout the country. But principally, it would have been those men or women that worked at the South African railways and harbors. They were in charge of the ports. They would be the ones that would be influential in sort of relaying information about how many vessels are in port, where they are traveling to, if they could get that sort of information, what sort of cargo is the ship carrying, etc. That would then be collated. It was very slow to make its way back to Johannesburg. Often it would be placed on trains So let's, for example, say it's from the Cape Town harbour. The intelligence would have to wind its way back up to Pretoria, sometimes first, be collated by the Oswald Brandwacht, be then sent to Rooseboom. And Rooseboom couldn't really decide on what intelligence he was sending through because he was being fed whatever the Oswald Brandwacht was giving him. So rudimentary, yes, but establishing contact with the Germans quite early on, which was, it's debatable how successful it was, but yes, it was there.
Enjoying the episode? Leave a review wherever you listen. YouTube, hit subscribe to keep us going. Let's carry on. So I'm thinking a bit about size here. First, how big was the Oswald Brandwacht organization at this point? And secondly, give or take, how large was Rooseboom's core network?
The grouping around Rooseboom, I think, was never more than maybe 5 to 10 people, as if it was that much, and that included the radio operator, whoever was involved. The Oswald Brandwacht as an organization is quite interesting because there were several 100,000 members in South Africa. Of course, they were not all involved in collecting intelligence, but the potential was there that, it was legio. There was quite a lot of people that could have been involved in it. But, for argument's sake, one could say that there were maybe several hundred people involved in just reporting. They didn't know what they were reporting on necessarily. They just reported on stuff that they thought might have been, I don't know. They were probably not even aware that they were passing it on to the Germans. They were just collecting some sort of intelligence or information that the organization was asking of them.
And that makes sense, right? Like often in this kind of network, you'd want people to only know what's necessary or, keep everything very compartmentalized, right?
Yeah.
Max, would you say that's your experience also, that people are kind of on a need-to-know basis? I'm assuming just from your direct experience in this kind of int and counter-int world.
Definitely. I actually think it was better before, back in the 80s, when you talk to intelligence veterans, it feels like people understood their role in a way that's very different from today. They kind of accepted being a part of a machine, knowing their place in the structure. But nowadays, I think egos play a much bigger role. People don't just want to be a cog in the wheel, they want to be a key player. And to do that, they hold on to information instead of passing it up the chain. And of course, that has always been an issue historically, but I think it's much, much worse now. And on the ground level, operatives used to be more content with their role. Today, people want to be seen as having a part to play on the bigger stage.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just that human element. We want to write ourselves into history a little bit. And going back to writing ourselves into history, as Rooseboom tried to do, and how did it eventually play out with the Oswald Brandwacht, Evert?
So it's actually quite interesting, and I think it comes back to this whole mass thing that you were talking about as well. But and principally with Rooseboom, it was ego. So of course the ego came into play because he thought of himself, I think, as being far bigger and more important than what he necessarily was, like being the cog in the wheel and having agency. But ultimately, he was reliant on the Oswald Brandwacht, and he couldn't really control what intelligence he was sending through. So that was, I think, one big bone of contention between him and the Oswald Brandwacht. So that was the one side. And the other side of the coin was, of course, the Oswald Brandwacht didn't want to they wanted to have direct communication between themselves and Germany. They didn't want to use this third party, which was now Rooseboom and his little secret organization. So that's where the ultimate fallout between them starts now. And he basically, in the end, Rooseboom becomes persona non grata, made by the Oswald Brandwacht. He picks it up in a message that he's supposed to encode and transmit, where he picks up that the organization is sort of getting ready to kick him out. And there's, of course, and we'll talk about it in the next podcast, there's the arrival of a new German agent in South Africa, Lothar Zittig. His code name was Felix. And he was going to we'll talk about the next time around, but he was far more successful than Rooseboom. But he also played the Oswald Brandwacht game. So yeah, Rooseboom becomes persona non grata. They even contemplate taking him out, the Oswald Brandwacht, because he knows quite a bit. He's not killed, but he has to go into hiding for a period of time. And he is soon eclipsed by this new Felix organization that would start functioning in South Africa from mid-1942 onwards. So Rooseboom is effectively on the scene from about 1940 to early 1942. One could probably say by the end of 1941, it already comes undone. But yeah, nevertheless, he was an important character. He was the first real link between Germany and the South African opposition. I mean, debatable on how successful it was, but it was important, and it would set the scene. It would be the foundation for this new organization that would be established after that.
It seems like the Germans didn't fully trust the Oswald Brandtwacht at this point. Am I right in thinking that?
So, yeah, I mean, it's not to give too much away, but I think Felix or Zitzig, they could control him more. But Hans van Rensburg and Leipold Werth, so van Rensburg in South Africa and Werth in South Africa, the evidence points to the fact that they had met before the war, that they had a secret code. If they were going to contact one another, they would use this code. And I think Rooseboom just didn't fit the mold. The ego, I think, was a big problem. And the fact that the Oswald Brandtwacht, that he was seen as a third party. He wasn't fully into the mix. And he couldn't offer them exactly what they wanted. They wanted that direct communication with Germany. And he was just not the vehicle that would achieve that for them. And he had a big mouth. So maybe they didn't trust him too much.
And that big mouth seems to come out even afterwards when he was caught and interrogated. He says he sunk 200 ships, or based on his intelligence, 200 ships were sunk, many soldiers were killed. And in your book, you say you're not sure about the accuracy of this, Evert. And could you maybe explain a little bit around that?
So, yeah, it's interesting. So if you look just at the period, and this ties in quite nicely with what we talked about in the Naval Warfare podcast, is that if you go look at the period that Rooseboom was active, there wasn't even that many. I mean, if he says 200 plus vessels, there wasn't even that many vessels sunk in South African waters. So it already calls just into question his sort of like inflated or bloated statistics that he puts out there, or that he presupposes that he was far more influential than what he actually was. And then, of course, if you're reporting on political intelligence, I mean, if it's stuff that's appearing in the newspaper, they could probably get that from anywhere. They could get it from somebody in Mozambique that was going across the border every day to buy a newspaper in Komatipoort. It wasn't really going to change the war. So yes, I think if you look at the basic facts in front of us, just from a naval warfare perspective, and his exaggerated claims, then I would call it hogwash.
I mean, in a way, that's the dream, right? Everything was a bit, no, not everything was better before, but some things were, like being able to get away with this kind of exaggeration. Today, you can't make up anything without 100 people online fact-checking you instantly. So there is no fun anymore. You can't even claim to have sunk 200 ships, which is pretty sad in a way.
Yeah. But of course, that's the benefit of history and the historical method, and being able to triangulate so many different sources. Well, you can speak truth to power, but I don't think this is speaking truth to power, but you can call out the BS when it is there.
So in the end, Rooseboom strikes a deal with the Smuts government. He gets off the hook as long as he keeps certain information buried.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because, of course, even though he was a German national, he was a naturalized South African. So by doing what he had done, by acting as a German agent, he was guilty of high treason, anyway, which way that you would argue it. But if you take the story and you tie it into what happens later in the war with the high treason case built against Hans van Rensburg, Rooseboom is mentioned, but he gets off quite scot-free. So he tells in his own, not really his memoir, but in an interview that they did with him at the Oswald Brandtwacht archive, which is fascinating because you can actually hear him speak. That was an audio interview, and there's a parrot yapping off in the background and an old lady with teacups and saucers coming in and it's shaking or whatever. You can hear all of these sort of like extra noises. But he mentions then that he had a lot of dirt on many of the South African politicians, and that was one of the reasons why he wasn't prosecuted for high treason. I don't really buy that. I think he probably turned state witness when they started building these cases of treason against Van Rensburg, because ultimately he had it in for the Oswald Brandtwacht. They were the one that scuppered him, that made him persona non grata with the Germans. So I think my taking is that he would have sold them out any given day. after what they had done to him. So I don't think it was because he was influential or who he knew. It was just that he wanted to get them back. And it's interesting. So if you go into the Oswald Brandtwag archive, there's only a little bit of information about this guy. There's his memoir that he wrote about his time in Germany. Of course, he doesn't mention that he was contacted by the Abwehr. Then there's this audio interview. And then there's the British intelligence, the MI5 files in London on him. But you have to sort of put all of this stuff together to try and get to the story of what there actually is. So he is, I think, a fringe character because we know certain things about him, but we don't know everything about him. And that makes it quite difficult.
We didn't manage to break into the MI5 archives, but thanks to Evert, we did get our hands on that old Rooseboom interview. Let's play a short clip from it.
Ik had gezien, nee, man, dingen verkeerd. Want ik had ook met die Polen natuurlijk te doen gehad. En die was zo uittartend dat ik had geweten, het is een groot volk wat hier komt, want Hitler zou dit nooit verdragen.
Was die Polen uittartend?
Oh, verschrikkelijk. En dan had mensen vermoord, mensen wat ik gekend heb. Dat was bijvoorbeeld in die logieshuis waar ik gewoond heb. Was het zo goed, denk ik. Daar was een mevrouw Zimmerman. Mevrouw Zimmerman. Zij had daar ook logeerd. Zij was van Bromberg. Het is een half Duitse stad, maar wat die Polen na die Eerste Wereldoorlog gekregen had. Dat was eigenlijk Duitse gebied.
That was Rooseboom, about as close to in the flesh as we will ever get. Thanks to the Records, Archives and Museum Division of Northwest University, and especially the Oswald Brandtwag Archival Collection for letting us use it and preserving that recording.
Very fascinating, and you've done your part in pushing, the discussion along, Evert, through a lot of detailed research. We'll add links to the show notes on this. But before we wrap up, do you want to give us a small hook to the next episode for the part 2 of Hitler's Spies in South Africa? You don't have to give away too much.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, Rooseboom now gets pushed out, and what will need to be established in his place would have to be a organization, of course, again, supported by the Germans, but this time from Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique, and with the explicit aim of making direct contact between South Africa, between the Oswald Brandtwag and Germany, and to really now start reporting on political and military and / naval intelligence. And this is what the Felix organization is going to do, and it's going to do this quite successfully. Well, it's going to have communication quite successfully for about 2 years. How important the intelligence was that they were passing along, we'll talk about as well. But I think just the audacity and how they went about building this network is quite important. And yeah, it's illuminating about what was happening in Southern Africa.
Really fascinating stuff. Again, a big thank you, Evert. It's always a pleasure. You are a part of the family, of course. We're going to have you on so many more times. And lastly, just to mention, we'll add the details of your various books in the show notes. And to our listeners, if you have any questions for Evert, just ping us, and we'll be sure to pass that along to him.
Evert, this has been a fascinating discussion, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week as usual with more. See you all then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone.